So, very good morning to one and all. In the last class we did many problems on that is current ratio and as well as liquid ratio, right. So, those ratios will comes under, that is the first ratio, that is in the case of our ratios we have a 4 types in that ratio. So, the first ratio is it's a liquidity ratio. So, under that just we got a 2 ratios. In the case of a liquidity ratio we got a 2 again we got a 2 ratios. So, the first one is it's a current ratio and the second one is a liquidity ratio. Okay. So, liquidity or a quick ratio, it is also called as liquid ratio, quick ratio and again acid test ratio. So, we did problems on these 2 aspects, that is one is current ratio and the second one is liquid ratio. Okay. So, the second, now in today's class, so the second type of ratio is it's a solvency ratio. In the case of our ratios we have a 4 categories. So, the first one is liquidity ratio, we already done the problems on those on that ratio. So, the second one is it's a solvency ratio. Okay. So, tell me what do you mean by this solvency, the word solvency. Yes. So, the solvency ratios, that is solvency refers to the ability of a concern to meet its long term obligations. Okay. Solvency is nothing but it is the ability of a concern to meet its long term obligations, not a short term or not a within a year. Instead of that it is related to long term. So, long term is nothing but obviously it is a more than a 1 year. Okay, that is what solvency. And solvency ratio baro hagidre, so solvency ratio is nothing but so the ratio which expresses the relationship between long term debt and the shareholders fund, that ratio is called as solvency ratio. Okay. Once again I will repeat the thing. So, solvency ratio is nothing but so the ratio which expresses the relationship between the long term debt and the shareholders fund. So, that ratio is called as solvency ratio. So, avaglan nimage helde it's a ability of a concern to meet its long term obligation anta. So, of course long term andag namge alli ಏನು ಇರಬೇಕು, long term debt ಇರಬೇಕು and along with that shareholders fund ಇರಬೇಕು. Okay. So, formula baro hagidre okay, before that once again I will repeat the thing. So, solvency ratios are nothing but so the ratio which expresses the relationship between long term debt and the shareholders fund, that ratio is called as solvency ratio. Okay. Just I will write here. Second one is solvency ratio. Okay. Yes. And in the case of a solvency ratio again we have a 2 categories. Okay. So, under a solvency ratio we have a 2 categories of a ratio. So, the first ratio is it's a debt equity ratio and the second one is proprietary ratio. Okay. So, the first one is debt equity ratio. Debt equity ratio and the second one is its proprietary ratio. So, solvency ratio is nothing but so the ratio which expresses the relationship between long term debt and a shareholders fund. So, under the solvency ratio again we have a 2 categories. So, the first one is debt equity ratio and the second one is proprietary ratio. Okay. So, ivaga first one ಗೆ ಬರೋ ಹಾಗಿದ್ರೆ that is debt equity ratio ಗೆ ಬರೋ ಹಾಗಿದ್ರೆ, so debt equity ratio measures the relationship between long term debt and the equity. Okay. So, the ratio which measures the relationship between the long term debt and the equity, that ratio is called as debt equity ratio. Okay. So, the name only mentioned, that is debt and equity. So, debt is nothing but under a solvency ratio this debt must be long term, right, and equity is nothing but it's a combination of that is equity share, preference shares. These 2 shares will comes under a equity. Okay. So, that is what, that is debt equity ratio is nothing but it includes the 2 aspects, one is the long term debt and the second one is a equity. Okay. So, the ratio which measures the relationship between the that is long term debt and shareholders fund, that one is what? Debt equity ratio. Okay. And to calculate a debt equity ratio, we have a formula, that is debt equity ratio is equals to long term debt divided by shareholders fund. Okay. So, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ಅಂದಾಗ ಏನಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ನಮಗೆ that is shareholders fund ಬಂದೇ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. Equity is nothing but it is a combination of a equity share, preference share and again reserves and a surplus. Okay. So, ಇದು ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ನಮಗೆ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ? Equity ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ. Okay. Yes, just I'll write the formula. Just I'll pick first one right now. So, formula for the calculation of a debt equity ratio, that is debt equity ratio is equals to long term debt divided by shareholders fund. Long term debt divided by shareholders fund. So, it is a formula for the calculation of a debt equity ratio. Okay. So, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ? ಲಾಂಗ್ ಟರ್ಮ್ ಡೆಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ and divided by shareholders fund ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. Again, to calculate a long term debt, again we have a formula. Okay. Formula for the calculation of a long term debt is long term debt is equals to debentures plus long term loans. Okay. Just I'll write here, to calculate a long term debt, just I'll take here long term debt is equals to debentures plus long term loans. Long term loans. So, this is the formula for the calculation of a long term debt. Okay. Again, to calculate a shareholders fund, again we have a formula, that is shareholders fund is equals to equity share capital plus preference share capital plus reserves and surplus minus fictitious assets. Okay. I am writing here, shareholders fund is equals to shareholders fund is equals to equity share capital plus preference share capital plus reserves and surplus minus fictitious assets. So, this is the formula for the calculation of a shareholders fund, that is equity share capital plus preference share capital plus reserves and surplus minus fictitious assets ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ we can get our shareholders fund. Again, fictitious assets andre enu? In the last class I have explained this one, that is fictitious assets. Okay. So, fictitious assets ಗೆ ನಾವು ಯಾವಾಗಲೂ ಏನು ತಗೊಂತೀವಿ? It's always preliminary expenses ಬರ್ತಾ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. So, preliminary expenses are nothing but the expenses which are incurred before the incorporation of a business. Okay. That is what a preliminary expenses. In case preliminary expenses ಬಂತು ಅಂದರೆ ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನು fictitious assets ಅಂಡರಲ್ಲಿ ತಗೊಳ್ತಾ ಹೋಗ್ತೀವಿ. Okay. This is all about your debt equity ratio. Okay. So, one more time I will explain the thing. So, in the case of a ratios we have a 4 categories. So, the first one is liquidity ratio. In the last class we did a problem on that ratio, that is current ratio ಮೇಲೆ problem ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ and again liquid ratio ಮೇಲೆ problem ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. So, these are the 2 categories of a liquidity ratio. Okay. This is the first type of a ratio. And ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಕ್ಲಾಸಲ್ಲಿ we are in the second type of a ratio. So, the second type of a ratio is, it's a solvency ratio. Okay. So, the solvency ratios are nothing but, so the ratio which expresses the ability of a concern to meet its long term obligations that ratio is called as solvency ratio. Okay. So, under a solvency ratio again we have a two categories. So, the first one is debt equity ratio and the second one is proprietary ratio. Okay. So, ivaga first one debt equity ratio ge baro hagidre, so the debt equity ratio meaning ig baro hagidre, so the ratio which expresses the relationship between long term debt and the shareholders fund, that ratio is called as debt equity ratio. Okay. So, to calculate a debt equity ratio we have a formula, that is debt equity ratio is equals to, so meaning allen helidwala, that is what long term debt divided by shareholders fund. Okay. This is the formula for the calculation of a debt equity ratio. And illig baro hagidre we have a long term debt and here we have a shareholders fund. Again we have a formula for the calculation of these two. Okay. So, to calculate a long term debt, here we have a formula. So, long term debt is equals to debentures plus long term loans. Okay. ನೀವು ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿರ್ಬೋದು ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ನಾವು ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಶೀಟ್ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ, ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಕೇಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಕಂಪ್ಯಾರಿಟಿವ್ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು or a ಕಾಮನ್ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು or a ಟ್ರೆಂಡ್ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, ದಿಸ್ ಟು ವಿಲ್ ಕಮ್ಸ್ ಅಂಡರ್ ಅ ನಾನ್ ಕರೆಂಟ್ ಲಯಬಿಲಿಟಿ. ಡೂ ಯು ರಿಮೆಂಬರ್? Yes, in the case of a balance sheet, so the Roman number 1 is, that is vertical balance sheet ali, Roman number 1 is equity and liability. So, under that we have a three categories, right. So, the first one is shareholders fund, under that we have a two categories, that is share capital and reserves and surplus. After the second one is, it's a non-current liability. So, under a non-current liability again we have a two categories, one is debentures and the second one is long-term loans. Okay. And the debt equity ratio is related to long term, right. So, long term in the sense obviously it's a combination of two aspects. So, the first one is the debentures and the second one is the long term loans. Alle namge non current liability il banditto ade same namge il bandide nodi. Okay. Yes. So, this is the formula, that is to calculate a long term debt we have a formula, that is debentures plus long term loans. Okay. And again to calculate a shareholders fund, again we have a formula, that is shareholders fund is equals to equity share capital plus preference share capital plus reserves and surplus and minus fictitious assets. So, fictitious assets are nothing but, it's always a preliminary expenses. So, the preliminary expenses are nothing but the expenses which are incurred before the incorporation of a business. Okay. So, business start ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೂ ಮುಂಚೆ ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ಗೋಸ್ಕರ ಮಾಡುವಂಥ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೆನ್ಸಸ್ಗಳು ನಮಗೆ ಏನಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಪ್ರಿಲಿಮಿನರಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೆನ್ಸಸ್ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ, ಫಿಕ್ಟಿಷಿಯಸ್ ಅಸೆಟ್ಸ್ ಅಂದರೆ ನಮಗೆ ಆಲ್ವೇಸ್ ಪ್ರಿಲಿಮಿನರಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೆನ್ಸಸ್ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಓಕೆ. ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ಆಲ್ ಅಬೌಟ್ ಯುವರ್ ಡೆಟ್ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋ. ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ ಇದೆನಾ ಇದು? ಸೊ, ಡೆಟ್ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ಇಸ್ ಅ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಟೈಪ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಸಾಲ್ವೆನ್ಸಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋ. ಓಕೆ. ಸೊ, ಇದಾದಮೇಲೆ second one is under a solvency ratio, it's a proprietary ratio. Okay. Just I'll wrap this. So, the second one is, it's a proprietary ratio. Yes, proprietary ratio. So, proprietary ratio expresses the relationship between shareholders fund to the assets. Okay. So, then madate, it expresses the relationship of a proprietors to the assets. So, shareholders are the proprietors of the company, right. So, shareholders na ನಾವು proprietors anta ಕರಿತೀವಿ. So, ಹಾಗಾಗಿ the ratio which expresses the relationship. Okay. So, which expresses the relationship of a proprietor to the total asset. So, that ratio is called as proprietary ratio. Okay. Again to calculate a proprietary ratio we have a formula, that is proprietary ratio is equals to shareholders fund divided by total assets. Okay. Just I am taking here. So, proprietary ratio is equals to shareholders fund divided by total assets. So this is the formula for the calculation of a proprietary ratio, that is shareholders fund divided by total assets. Okay, already we knew the formula for the calculation of a shareholders fund in the case of a debt equity ratio. Alle naven madidivi formula already calculate madidivi, that is shareholders fund is equals to equity share capital plus preference share capital plus reserves and surplus minus fictitious assets madidre we can get our shareholders fund. ಇದನ್ನ ನಾವೇನು ಮಾಡಿರ್ತೀವಿ ಡೆಟ್ ಇಕ್ವಿಟಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋದಲ್ಲೇ ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತೀವಿ. ಹಿಯರ್ ವಿ ನೀಡ್ ಅ ಟೋಟಲ್ ಅಸೆಟ್ಸ್. ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಅ ಕ್ಯಾಟಗರಿ ಆಫ್ ಅಸೆಟ್. Here we need a complete total of assets. So total assets are nothing but it includes both fixed assets and as well as current assets. So ನಿಮ್ಮ ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಶೀಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಏನು ಟೋಟಲ್ ಅಂತ ಸಿಗುತ್ತಲ್ಲ ನಿಮಗೆ ಅಸೆಟ್ ಸೈಡ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ, ಸೊ ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ವಿ ನೀಡ್ ಅಂಡರ್ ಅ ಟೋಟಲ್ ಅಸೆಟ್ಸ್. ಓಕೆ, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆ ಹೇಳಿರೋದು ಟೋಟಲ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ನಾಟ್ ಅ ಫಿಕ್ಸ್ಡ್ ಅಸೆಟ್ಸ್ ಆರ್ ನಾಟ್ ಅ ಕರೆಂಟ್ ಅಸೆಟ್ಸ್, ಬಟ್ ಹಿಯರ್ ಇಟ್ ಮೆನ್ಷನ್ ದ ವರ್ಡ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಟೋಟಲ್. ಸೊ ಟೋಟಲ್ ಇಸ್ ನಥಿಂಗ್ ಬಟ್ ವಿ ನೀಡ್ ಅ ಕಂಪ್ಲೀಟ್ ಅಮೌಂಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ asset side. Okay, so here we need a complete amount of an asset side, that is what total assets. And shareholders fund already ನಾವು debt equity ratio ದಲ್ಲೇ ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತೀವಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಎಸ್ ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ ಆಯ್ತು ಎರಡು ಫಾರ್ಮುಲಾ ನಿಮಗೆ. Solvency ratio ದಲ್ಲಿ we have a two categories, one is debt equity ratio and the second one is a proprietary ratio. So ಎರಡು ರೇಷಿಯೋ ಮೇಲೆ ನಾವು ಇವತ್ತು ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡೋಣ. ಓಕೆ, ಎಸ್ ದ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ that is ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ಡೆಟ್ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ಅಂಡ್ ಪ್ರೊಪ್ರೈಟರಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಡೆಟ್ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಂಡ್ ಅಲಾಂಗ್ ವಿತ್ ದಟ್ ಪ್ರೊಪ್ರೈಟರಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋನು ಕೂಡ ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಇನ್ ದ ಕ್ವೆಶನ್ ದೇ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಗಿವನ್ 4 ಐಟಮ್ಸ್. ಸೊ ದ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಒನ್ ಈಸ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ ಲಾಂಗ್ ಟರ್ಮ್ ಡೆಟ್, ಇಟ್ಸ್ 4 lakh, and second one is current liability they have given, it's a 1 lakh, and next third one is a total assets 10 lakh they have given in the problem, and finally they have given shareholders fund, it's a 5 lakh. So totally they have mentioned the 4 items. So based on this we need to calculate a debt equity ratio and as well as proprietary ratio. Okay, firstly I will enter, that is calculation of a debt equity ratio. Okay, yes, to calculate a debt equity ratio we have a formula, that is debt equity ratio is equals to long term debt divided by shareholders fund. Just I will apply that formula. Debt equity ratio is equals to long term debt divided by shareholders fund. Okay, yes, this is the formula for the calculation of a debt equity ratio. So ಬನ್ನಿ question ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿ, firstly we need a long term debt, right? So ನೋಡಿ question ಅಲ್ಲಿ long term debt mention ಮಾಡಿದಾರಾ? Yes, directly they have mentioned that. So the first item in the case of a question, it's a long term debt. So how much they have given? It's a 4 lakh, right? Yes, 4 lakh divided by, so ನೋಡಿ ಶೇರ್ ಹೋಲ್ಡರ್ಸ್ ಫಂಡ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಅಥವಾ ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾ ಅಂತ. ಅಗೇನ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಕ್ವೆಶನ್ ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಐಟಮ್, ಫೋರ್ತ್ ಐಟಮ್, ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟ್ಲಿ ದೇ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಮೆನ್ಷನ್ ದಟ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ ಶೇರ್ ಹೋಲ್ಡರ್ಸ್ ಫಂಡ್. ಓಕೆ, ಹೌ ಮಚ್? ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ 5 lakh. ಸೊ ಹಿಯರ್ ಐ ಆಮ್ ಟೇಕಿಂಗ್ 5 lakh. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ ಅಲ್ಗೇನಾಯಿತು 4 lakh ಡಿವೈಡೆಡ್ ಬೈ 5 lakh ಆಯಿತು. ಸೊ ಝೀರೋಸ್, ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ 5 zeros and again 5 zeros ಕ್ಯಾನ್ಸಲ್ ಆಯಿತು. ಸೊ ಫೈನಲಿ ವಿ ಗಾಟ್ 4 divided by 5, ರೈಟ್? ಸೊ ಅಗೇನ್ ನೋಡಿ ಮತ್ತೆ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ಸಲ್ ಆಗುತ್ತಾ? ಕ್ಯಾನ್ಸಲ್ ಆಗಲ್ಲ ಇದು. ಅಗೇನ್ ಹೋದ್ರು 1 4s 1 5s ಆಗಬೇಕು. ಸೊ 1 ಇಂದ, ಸೊ ಅಗೇನ್ ದೇರ್ ಇಸ್ ನೋ ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಷನ್. ಸೊ ಫೈನಲಿ debt equity ratio is equals to 4:5. Clear ಆಯಿತು ನಮಗೆ zeros cancel ಆಯಿತು. So the remaining is it's a 4 divided by 5. So 4 divided by 5 is nothing but 4:5 because we are in the case of a ratios. So we must shown in the is to wise. Okay. So 4:5 is our answer, that is debt equity ratio is equals to 4:5. So secondly we need to calculate a proprietary ratio. Okay. So here I will take, that is calculation of proprietary ratio. Proprietary ratio, again we have a formula for the calculation of a proprietary ratio, that is proprietary ratio is equals to shareholders fund divided by total assets. Okay. Yes, just I'll write the formula. Proprietary ratio is equals to shareholders fund divided by total assets. Shareholders fund divided by total assets. Okay. So we already knew the shareholders fund, that is they have only given in the case of a question. So shareholders fund is, it's a 5 lakh, right? Just I will enter here 5 lakh divided by, we need a total assets. Again in the case of a question only they have mentioned that it's a total assets, that is third item in the case of a question is it's a total assets, it's 10 lakh. Okay. So shareholders fund 5 lakh and total assets 10 lakh. These two both are mentioned in the case of a problem itself. Okay. So again ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೋ ಹಾಗಿದ್ರೆ 5 zeros and again 5 zeros cancel ಆಯಿತು, that is 5 ones 5 twos. Okay. So ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಬಂತು answer 1 divided by 2 we got, right? So here, so proprietary ratio is equals to 1:2. Clear? Yes, this is our answer. So ಇಲ್ಲಿ 5 lakh divided by 10 lakh ಆಯಿತು, ಇಲ್ಲಿ 5 zeros, ಇಲ್ಲಿ 5 zeros cancel ಆಯಿತು. So ಉಳಿದಿರೋದು ನಮಗೆ 5 divided by 10. So 5 ones are 5 and 5 twos are 10. So 1 divided by 2. Okay. So here proprietary ratio is equals to 1:2. Okay. So finally our answer is, so debt equity ratio is equals to 4:5 and proprietary ratio is equals to 1:2. So this is our final answer. Okay. So debt equity ratio 4:5 and proprietary ratio 1:2. So ಈ ಕ್ವೆಶನ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮಗೆ ಸೊ ಎಲ್ಲಾನು ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಅವರೇ ಮೆನ್ಷನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಸೊ ಬೇಸ್ಡ್ ಆನ್ ದಟ್ ಬೈ ಅಪ್ಲೈಯಿಂಗ್ ಅ ಫಾರ್ಮುಲಾ ಸೊ ನಾವಿಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ವಿ. ಓಕೆ. ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಪ್ರೊಪ್ರೈಟರಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ಅಂಡ್ ಆಸ್ ವೆಲ್ ಆಸ್ ಡೆಟ್ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋ. Okay. Yes. Now we will move towards the second problem on it. So the second problem is, so they have given the balance sheet of a Raj Limited. Okay. So Raj Limited presents to you the following balance sheet as on 31st March 2012 ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ರಾಜ್ ಲಿಮಿಟೆಡ್ದು ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಶೀಟ್ನ ಪ್ರೊವೈಡ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಆನ್ 31st 2012 ದ ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಶೀಟ್ ಇದು. ಸೊ ವಿ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಅ ಲಿಸ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಲಯಬಿಲಿಟೀಸ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅಸೆಟ್ಸ್. ಸೊ ಲಯಬಿಲಿಟೀಸ್ ಓದ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ ಫಸ್ಟಲ್ಲಿ, ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಶೇರ್ ಕ್ಯಾಪಿಟಲ್ ಹೆಡ್ಡಿಂಗ್ ಅಂಡರ್ಲೈನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಅಂಡರ್ ದಟ್ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ಶೇರ್ ಆಫ್ ₹10 ಈಚ್ 20 lakh ಇದೆ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ಲಿ ಜನರಲ್ ರಿಸರ್ವ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ 2 lakh. And next one is 8% debentures, it's 6 lakh. And nextly long term loans they have given, it's a 4 lakh. And finally in the case of a liability side, it's a creditors, they have given ₹6 lakh. Okay. This is all about your liability side. So now asset side ಗೆ ಬರೋ ಹಾಗಿದ್ರೆ fixed assets they have mentioned, it's a 20 lakh. And stock 8 lakh, debtors 6 lakh and cash 4 lakh. So total both the side it's a 38 lakh. Okay, so total ಎರಡು ಕಡೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿರೋದು ನಿಮಗೆ 38 lakh ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. And finally they says that calculate debt equity ratio and a proprietary ratio ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. So debt equity ratio and along with that proprietary ratio ನ calculate ಮಾಡಿ ಅಂತ. Okay, so balance sheet base ಮೇಲೆ we are required to calculate a debt equity ratio and a proprietary ratio. Okay, yes, just I'll take the heading. Firstly, so calculation of debt equity ratio. So calculation of calculation of debt equity ratio. Again, to calculate a debt equity ratio we have a formula, that is long term debt divided by shareholders fund. Okay, just to apply the formula here. Debt equity ratio is equals to long term debt divided by shareholders fund. Okay, this is the formula for the calculation of a debt equity ratio, that is long term debt divided by shareholders fund. In the case of a last problem, they have only mentioned directly about a long term debt and a shareholders fund, but in this problem we have a list of liabilities and list of assets. So here we need a long term debt under shareholders fund which comes under a liability side. Okay, liability side alli baruvanthadu idella. So long term debt kuda namige en beku, and again along with that we need a shareholders fund. So last problem tara namage illi direct agi kottilla. So ನಾವು ಇವಾಗ ಏನು ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ, firstly we need to calculate a long term debt and afterwards we will calculate a shareholders fund. So based on these two solution we will come to know about the debt equity ratio. So now firstly we need to calculate a long term debt. Okay, again to calculate a long term debt, again we have a formula, that is debentures plus long term loans. Okay, so I am taking here so long term debt is equals to debentures plus long term loans. Okay, yes, this is the formula. So ನೋಡಿ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಕ್ವೆಶ್ಚನ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿ, ಸೊ ಡಿಬೆಂಚರ್ಸ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರಾ, ಲಯಬಿಲಿಟಿ ಸೈಡ್ ನೋಡಿ ಡಿಬೆಂಚರ್ಸ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರಾ. ಎಸ್ ವಿ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ 8% ಡಿಬೆಂಚರ್ಸ್. ಎಷ್ಟಿದೆ ಡಿಬೆಂಚರ್ಸ್ ಅಮೌಂಟ್ 6 lakh ಇದೆ. ಸೊ ಎಂಟ್ರಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ, ಇಟ್ಸ್ 6 lakh. ಸೊ ಪ್ಲಸ್ ಇದೆ, ಪ್ಲಸ್ ಹಾಕ್ತಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಸೊ ನೋಡಿ ಲಾಂಗ್ ಟರ್ಮ್ ಲೋನ್ಸ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರಾ, ಇದು ಕೂಡ ನಿಮಗೆ ಲಯಬಿಲಿಟಿ ಸೈಡಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುತ್ತೆ ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಲೋನ್ಸ್ ಆರ್ ಲಯಬಿಲಿಟಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ ನೋಡಿ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಲಾಂಗ್ ಟರ್ಮ್ ಲೋನ್. ಎಸ್ ಅಗೇನ್ ಲಾಂಗ್ ಟರ್ಮ್ ಲೋನ್ ಕೂಡ ಅವರೇ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಶೀಟಲ್ಲಿದೆ, ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ 4 lakh rupees. Yes, we have both, that is debentures and long term loan. So finally long term debt is equals to 6 lakh plus 4 lakh, it's a 10 lakh. Okay, yes, it's a long term debt is 10 lakh rupees. Okay, so now we come to know the long term debt. So now we need a shareholders fund. Again we have a formula for the calculation of a shareholders fund, that is equity share capital plus preference share capital plus reserves and surplus minus fictitious assets. Okay, just I'll enter the formula, that is shareholders fund is equals to shareholders fund is equals to equity share capital plus preference share capital plus reserves and surplus minus fictitious assets. Okay, this is the formula for the calculation of a shareholders fund. So ಇದರಲ್ಲಿರುವಂಥ ಐಟಮ್ಸ್ಗಳೆಲ್ಲನೂ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಶೀಟಲ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮಲ್ಲಿ ಇರಲೇಬೇಕಂತೇನಿಲ್ಲ. ಇಫ್ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಕೇಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಮೀನ್ಸ್ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ವಿ ಗೋಸ್ ಆನ್ ಎಂಟರಿಂಗ್ ದಟ್. ಇಫ್ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಗಿವನ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಮೀನ್ಸ್ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಲೀವ್ ಇಟ್. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ ನೋಡಿ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ನೋಡಿ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ಶೇರ್ ಕ್ಯಾಪಿಟಲ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರಾ. ಎಸ್, ವಿ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಅ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ಶೇರ್ ಕ್ಯಾಪಿಟಲ್ ಆಫ್ ₹10 ಈಚ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಎಷ್ಟಿದೆ? ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ 20 lakh ಇದೆ. ಸೊ ಎಂಟರ್ ಹಿಯರ್ 20 lakh ಪ್ಲಸ್. ಸೊ ನೋಡಿ ಪ್ರಿಫರೆನ್ಸ್ ಶೇರ್ ಕ್ಯಾಪಿಟಲ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರಾ. ಇನ್ ದ ಕೇಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಕ್ವೆಶನ್, ಸೊ ವಿ ಡೋಂಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಅ ಪ್ರಿಫರೆನ್ಸ್ ಶೇರ್ ಕ್ಯಾಪಿಟಲ್. ಸೊ ಅಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಇದೇನಾಯಿತು? ನಿಲ್ ಆಯಿತು. ಓಕೆ, ಅಗೇನ್ ಪ್ಲಸ್ ಇದೆ, ಪ್ಲಸ್ ತಗೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಸೊ ನೋಡಿ ರಿಸರ್ವ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಸರ್ಪ್ಲಸ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರಾ. ಎಸ್, ವಿ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಅ ಜನರಲ್ ರಿಸರ್ವ್. ಹೌ ಮಚ್? ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ 2 lakh. Yes, 2 lakh. So minus, so fictitious assets like a preliminary expenses ಏನಾದ್ರು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಥವಾ fictitious assets ಅಂತಾನೆ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟಾಗಿ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರಾ? ನಾಟ್ ಗಿವನ್. ಅಗೇನ್ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಇದೇನಾಯ್ತು? ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಲ್ ಆಯಿತು. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ ನಾವು ಸೊ 20 lakh ಪ್ಲಸ್ 2 lakh, ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ 22 lakh. 22 lakh. So shareholders fund is equals to 22 lakh. Okay, yes, 22 lakh rupees ಆಯಿತು. ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ ಇದೆ ಇದು ಶೇರ್ ಹೋಲ್ಡರ್ಸ್ ಫಂಡ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಅಗೇನ್ ಲಾಂಗ್ ಟರ್ಮ್ ಡೆಟ್. ಸೊ ಇವಾಗ ನಮಗೆ ಫಾರ್ಮುಲಾದಲ್ಲಿರೋ 2 ಐಟಮ್ಸ್ಗಳು ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದೆ. ಇವಾಗ ನಾವು ಮೇನ್ ಫಾರ್ಮುಲಾಗೆ ಅಪ್ಲೈ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಸೊ ಹಿಯರ್ ಐ ಆಮ್ ಟೇಕಿಂಗ್ ಸೊ ಡೆಟ್ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋ is equals to, so long term debt divided by shareholders fund ಇದೆ. ಸೊ ಎಷ್ಟಿದೆ ಲಾಂಗ್ ಟರ್ಮ್ ಡೆಟ್? 10 lakh ಇದೆ. ಸೊ ತಗೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ 10 lakh ಡಿವೈಡೆಡ್ ಬೈ, ಸೊ ಶೇರ್ ಹೋಲ್ಡರ್ಸ್ ಫಂಡ್ ಇದೆ. ಸೊ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಶೇರ್ ಹೋಲ್ಡರ್ಸ್ ಫಂಡ್ ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ 22 lakh. ಓಕೆ, ಅಗೇನ್ 5 zeros ಕ್ಯಾನ್ಸಲ್ ಆಯಿತು. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ 5 zeros ಕ್ಯಾನ್ಸಲ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅಗೇನ್ 2 5s ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅಗೇನ್ 2 11s. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ 2 5s 10 ಆಯಿತು, 2 11s 22 ಆಯಿತು. ಸೊ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮಗೆ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದೆಷ್ಟು? 5 ಡಿವೈಡೆಡ್ ಬೈ 11 ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದೆ. ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ 2 5s 10 ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ 2 11s 22. ಸೊ 5 ಡಿವೈಡೆಡ್ ಬೈ 11 ಆಯಿತು. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ 5 ಡಿವೈಡೆಡ್ ಬೈ 11. ಸೊ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಐ ಟೇಕ್ ಶ್ಯೂರ್. Yes, debt equity ratio is equals to 5:11. Yes, 5:11. That is debt equity ratio is equals to 5 divided by 11 bantu. So 5 divided by 11 is nothing but is a 5:11. This is what our debt equity ratio. So the first one. Okay, so secondly we need to calculate a proprietary ratio. Okay, yes, it's the B, calculation of proprietary ratio. Yes, calculation of proprietary ratio. Again, to calculate a proprietary ratio, we have a formula, that is proprietary ratio is equals to shareholders fund divided by total assets. Okay, is here. Proprietary ratio is equals to shareholders fund divided by total assets. Okay, so shareholders fund already calculate ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ in the case of a debt equity ratio itself. Just we got shareholders fund, it's 22 lakh. Okay, and now we need a total assets. Okay, so total assets andaga there is no calculation at all, just simply we need to refer a total of a balance sheet. Okay, that is asset side ಎಷ್ಟಿದೆ ನೋಡಿ, of course assets ಮತ್ತು liabilities ಯಾವಾಗಲೂ ಈಕ್ವಲ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಎಷ್ಟಿದೆ ನೋಡಿ ಟೋಟಲ್ ನಮಗೆ, that is 38 lakh ಇದೆ, right? That is what are total assets. Okay, so now I am applying the formula. So shareholders fund in the case of a debt equity ratio delle calculate ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ, just we got a 22 lakh. I am writing here, it's a 22 lakh and divided by, so total assets ನೋಡಿ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಶೀಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ, we have a total, that is asset side ಆಗಿರಬಹುದು liabilities ಆಗಿರಬಹುದು, our total amount is 38 lakh. 38 lakh. Yes, 22 lakh divided by 38 lakh. Yes, just a minute. Yes. So ಇವಾಗ ಬರೋ ಹಾಗಿದ್ರೆ again 5 zeros and again 5 zeros cancel ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. The remaining is 22 divided by 13. Okay, so ಇದು ನೋಡಿ ನಮಗೆ 2 ಇಂದ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ಸಲ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, that is 2 11s are 2 19s. Okay, so 2 11s are 22 ಆಯಿತು and 2 19s are 38 ಆಯಿತು. So 11 divided by 19 we got. Okay, so here proprietary ratio is equals to 11:19. Yes, 11:19, that is our proprietary ratio. So finally we will enter our final answer, that is debt equity ratio is equals to 5:11 and proprietary ratio is equals to 11:19. So this is our final answer. ಎರಡು ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಕ್ಕೆ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು, ಸೊ ಎರಡು ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿಬಿಟ್ಟು ಆನ್ಸರ್ನ ಎಂಟ್ರಿ ಮಾಡಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ ಇದೆನಾ ಇದು ನಿಮಗೆ? ಎಸ್, ಎಸ್, these are all the two problems under a solvency ratio, that is debt equity ratio ಮತ್ತು proprietary ratio ಮೇಲೆ ಎರಡು ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಸ್ ಇದು. ಓಕೆ, so the next type of a ratio, okay, this completes your solvency ratio. So the next one, that is third type of a ratio, is it's a activity ratio. Okay, so the first one is a liquidity ratio, second one is a solvency ratio, and the third one is it's a activity ratio. Okay, still rub this. So the third type of a ratio is activity ratio. Activity ratio. So this activity ratio is also called as performance ratio and also called as turnover ratio. So turnover ratio andru ಒಂದೇ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, performance ratio andru ಒಂದೇ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, and as well as activity ratio andru ಒಂದೇ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. So ಹೇಳಿ what do you mean by this activity ratio or a performance ratio or a turnover movement? Okay, so ಏನಿರ್ಬೋದು, so the name only mention the meaning, that is activity, performance or a turnover. Yes, so activity ratios are ratios which measure the level of activity or the performance or operating efficiency of an enterprise. Okay, so the ratio which expresses the or which measures the level of activity or a level of performance or a level of operating efficiency of an enterprise, that ratio is called as activity ratio or a performance ratio or a turnover ratio. So ಯಾವ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ಪರ್ಫಾರ್ಮೆನ್ಸ್ನಾಗಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ಆಕ್ಟಿವಿಟಿ ಲೆವೆಲ್ನಾಗಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ಆಪರೇಟಿಂಗ್ ಲೆವೆಲ್ನಾಗಲಿ ಒಂದು ಎಂಟರ್ಪ್ರೈಸ್ದು ಮೆಷರ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೋ, ಸೊ ಆ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ನಮಗೇನಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಆಕ್ಟಿವಿಟಿ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ. Okay, so one more time I'll explain the meaning. So activity ratios are nothing but the ratios which measure the level of a activity or a performance or a efficiency or operating efficiency of an enterprise. That ratio is called as activity ratio. Okay. So under a activity ratio we have a 3 categories or a 3 types of ratios we have under activity ratio. Okay. So the first one is it's a inventory turnover ratio, and the second one is trade receivables turnover ratio, and the third one is it's a trade payables turnover ratio. Okay, just I'll enter here. So under that, so the first one is inventory turnover ratio. Okay, so inventory turnover ratio, it is also called as stock turnover ratio, because inventory andru onde agutte, stock andru onde agutte. For that reason inventory turnover ratio na we can also call it as stock turnover ratio. Okay, and the second one is it's a trade receivables turnover ratio. Okay, yes, trade receivables turnover ratio may also called as debtors turnover ratio, or also called as accounts receivable ratio. Okay, that is accounts receivable turnover ratio. So ನೀವು ಇದನ್ನ simple ಆಗಿ if you want, you can, instead of trade receivables, you can we can use the word of a debtors turnover ratio, because debtors creditors ನಮಗೆ ಯೂಶುವಲ್ ಆಗಿ ವರ್ಡ್ ಗೊತ್ತಿರೋದ್ರಿಂದ. ಸೊ ನಿಮಗೆ ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ರಿಸೀವಬಲ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಏನಾದ್ರು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಲಿಟ್ಲ್ ಬಿಟ್ ಡಿಫಿಕಲ್ಟ್ ಅಂತ ಅನಿಸ್ತು ಅಂದರೆ ಯು ಮೇ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ಯೂಸ್ ದ ವರ್ಡ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ debtors turnover ratio. Okay, just I'll write here debtors itself. Okay, so the second one is it's a debtors turnover ratio. So this debtors turnover ratio is also called as trade receivables ratio and also called as accounts receivable turnover ratio. Okay, and the third one is creditors turnover ratio. Yes, creditors turnover ratio. So the third type of activity ratio is creditors turnover ratio. So this creditors turnover ratio is also called as trade payables turnover ratio, or also called as accounts payable turnover ratio. So accounts payable turnover ratio andru onde agutte, trade payables turnover ratio andru onde agutte, and in simple nimage gottiro word alli, so creditors turnover ratio andru onde agutte. Okay, these are all the that is 3 categories of a activity ratio. Okay, so first ನಾವು ಇವಾಗ ಇದನ್ನ ಇನ್ವೆಂಟರಿ ಟರ್ನ್ ಓವರ್ ರೇಷಿಯೋದ ಫಾರ್ಮುಲಾಸ್ ಏನಿದೆ, ಇನ್ಫಾರ್ಮೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಏನಿದೆ ನೋಡ್ತಾ ಹೋಗೋಣ. Okay, let's tell me what do you mean by this, that is stock turnover ratio or inventory turnover ratio. Yes, so stock turnover ratio or inventory turnover ratio indicates the number of times the stock is turned over during a year. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ ಈ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ನಮಗೆ ಏನನ್ನು ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಡತ್ತೆ ಅಥವಾ ಏನನ್ನು ಇಂಡಿಕೇಟ್ ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ದ ನಂಬರ್ ಆಫ್ ಟೈಮ್ಸ್ ದ ಸ್ಟಾಕ್ ಈಸ್ ಟರ್ನ್ಡ್ ಓವರ್ ಡ್ಯೂರಿಂಗ್ ಅ ಇಯರ್. ಸೊ ಸ್ಟಾಕ್ ಎಷ್ಟು ಸಲ ಟರ್ನ್ ಓವರ್ ಆಯಿತು ಪರ್ ಇಯರಲ್ಲಿ, 1 ಇಯರಲ್ಲಿ, ಡ್ಯೂರಿಂಗ್ ಅ ಇಯರಲ್ಲಿ, ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಏಪ್ರಿಲ್ 1st ಟು ಮಾರ್ಚ್ 31st ಒಳಗಡೆಗೆ ಡ್ಯೂರಿಂಗ್ ಅ ಇಯರಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ಟಾಕ್ ಹೌ ಮೆನಿ ಟೈಮ್ಸ್ ಇಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ ಬೀನ್ ಟರ್ನ್ ಓವರ್ಡ್ ಅಂತ ಇಂಡಿಕೇಟ್ ಮಾಡೋ ರೇಷಿಯೋನ ನಮಗೆ ಏನಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಇನ್ವೆಂಟರಿ ಟರ್ನ್ ಓವರ್ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಅವರ ಸ್ಟಾಕ್ ಟರ್ನ್ ಓವರ್ ರೇಷಿಯೋ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ. So in simple, the ratio which indicates the times of, that is number of times the stock is turned over during the year, that ratio is called as inventory turnover ratio or stock turnover ratio. So ನಾವು ಇದನ್ನ inventory turnover ratio ಅಂತಾನೂ ಕರಿತೀವಿ and stock turnover ratio ಅಂತಾನೂ ಕರಿತೀವಿ. Okay, again to calculate a stock turnover ratio we have a formula, or to calculate a inventory turnover ratio we have a formula, that is cost of goods sold or cost of revenue from operation divided by average inventory. Okay, so I'll take here inventory turnover ratio is equals to, just a minute, start from here. So inventory turnover ratio is equals to cost of goods sold or cost of revenue from operation. Okay, just simply I'll write cost of goods sold or cost of, that is cost of revenue from operation divided by average inventory. I don't have a space here, so simply, so COGS is nothing but cost of goods sold, okay, and CORFO is nothing but cost of revenue from operation. So cost of goods, if it is given in the problem, you can take as a cost of goods sold, and sometimes in the case of a question they have mentioned CORF, that is cost of revenue from operation, instead of a COGS. Okay, so cost of goods sold kotre cost of goods togoli. In case cost of revenue from operation kotidare andre cost of revenue from operation togoli. So both are same. Okay, like revenue from operation andru onde agate and again sales andru onde agate, right? So same thing happens here also. So COGS is nothing but cost of goods sold, and sometimes in the question they have mentioned that is CORFO instead of a COGS, that is cost of revenue from operation divided by average inventory. So this is the formula for the calculation of a inventory turnover ratio. Okay, so cost of goods sold or a cost of revenue from operation divided by average inventory. Again, to calculate a COGS or CORFO and average inventory, we have a formula, and to calculate a cost of goods sold, we have a two formulas. Okay, so the first formula is cost of goods sold is equals to sales minus gross profit. Okay, so that is COGS. Yes, COGS calculate ಮಾಡಕ್ಕೆ we have a that is COGS ಆದರೂ ತಗೊಳ್ಳಿ, CORFO ಆದರೂ ತಗೊಳ್ಳಿ. So to calculate a COGS or CORFO, we have a formula, that is sales minus gross profit. Sales minus gross profit. This is the formula for the calculation of a cost of goods sold. Or we have one more formula again to calculate a COGS or CORFO. Again to calculate this, we have a one more formula, that is opening inventory plus purchases plus direct expenses minus closing inventory ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ we can get our cost of goods sold, that is opening inventory plus purchases plus direct expenses minus